Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Rebekah Hanna. She's the president and CEO of Anchored Virtual, formerly Anchored Hope Virtual Counseling, and we'll talk about that recent name change briefly in our conversation, and a host of This versus That, conversations that explore what we think and why we think it. Rebekah, or Bekah as she said I could call her, and I are going to talk about the hurdles she had to overcome as they started their podcast, how they've booked well-known performing artists, authors, and podcasters as guests on their show, and their simple but effective workflow for producing their podcast. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Bekah Hanna. Well, Bekah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
I am happy to be here.
Yeah, so I first heard about your podcast from my wife, who saw that you had Abby Wedgeworth on and a few months ago, and she shared it with me. And I looked at the concept for the show, and I was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." And you're comparing two topics, so the show is called This versus That. And so, with the episode with Abby was exhaustion versus perseverance. Then I went on to learn that the podcast is also basically a resource from your virtual counseling ministry. So we'll talk about that a little bit here in a second, but it's called Anchored Hope. And so I wanted to have you on the show to hear about your podcasting journey and what you've learned over the past year and a half. So let's start back with Anchored Hope. So you're the president and CEO of Anchored Hope Virtual Counseling. And so I'd love to hear your story behind starting a biblically grounded, clinically informed virtual counseling ministry.
Yeah, well, Anchored Hope comes from a long journey. That's what I tell people. I've done counseling for a long time in a lot of different contexts. And so Anchored Hope really is this conglomeration of what I have learned from doing counseling in a lot of different ministry contexts and what would I want as a staff member at a church, as a ministry worker for a college campus, all the way to if I'm just a Christian owning my own business and I want to care for my employees. What kind of resource can we build to actually make counseling accessible to anyone, anytime, anywhere? Because what you find is that counseling isn't as accessible, even though the mental health conversation is more free-flowing now than it ever has been. We still don't have great access to decent care a lot of the time. So it really was birthed out of this idea of there's great training, there's great equipping, there's amazing counselors who are doing incredible work, but how do we make them actually accessible? So there's a grief content ministry actually in Delaware. I did not know them. They were starting a counseling organization, and I had been blogging and writing articles for a long time, and I had built out the back of my website that doesn't really exist anymore to be what Anchored Hope is. So we joined forces with them. They are called Mark Inc., Markinc. And they really funded us getting off the ground together. And so that was right as COVID was hitting. And so it was going to work, but it really worked because of COVID, because people just got used to this virtual concept. Right. And there's pros and cons of virtual counseling for sure, but by maximizing the pros, we've grown really fast. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So you decided to go virtual before COVID even. Yeah. So you kind of laid that out a little bit, but why decide to do that as opposed to maybe doing both, like in person and online? What was the thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there's this emphasis on access, right? And so because there's a serious lack of actually good biblical counseling around the world, this was just an opportunity to really redeem technology. You know, technological advances, they reflect an aspect of the Imago Dei, and we are created to function as these sub-creators in a sense of the glory of God. And so for me, it was the sense that we can take every form of technology that is massively corrupted by sin, and we can actually equip it and redeem it to be tools of technology for God-glorifying, kingdom-oriented purposes. And so, and it financially helps us out because we are a nonprofit and because we want to make counseling accessible. Part of that is making it affordable. And by not having overhead of a building and by not having overhead of paying for the lights to be turned on, in a sense, everyone, all the counselors need their lights on when they're counseling, but it just helps us financially as a nonprofit to put all of our eggs in that virtual basket.
Nice. So you live in New York City.
I do.
And you're running a virtual counseling business.
I am.
And so I'm guessing you really love living in New York City, because my original thought with that was like, oh, if you're doing virtual counseling, you can live anywhere. Mm-hmm. So what makes you want to live in New York City, which does have a high cost of living? So what was the thought process there? What made sense for you?
Boy, does it ever. I feel the pain of that often. I'm on staff at a church in New York City.
Yeah.
And it's very much of a global sense that does flow, and understanding that we want Anchored Hope to be a global ministry. And so in a lot of ways, we felt like, as the CEO, being in New York City made sense for Anchored Hope, because we want to impact all the cultures that are, around the world, but also here in the States. And so for Anchored Hope, it made sense for me to be here. But also, as a family, we're committed to being in New York City as a family, as missionaries, and as someone who's in ministry. And our family has lived here before. I did ministry on campus at Columbia University in an Ivy League ministry for a long time, and years ago. So this is actually my third time moving to New York City. And if you know how hard it is to move and get here, and if you've done it 3 times, you're like, yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here. So we're committed as a family to raise our kids here on purpose for the coming kingdom of God. So we're here to do ministry.
That's great. Very cool. Very cool. So at what point did you decide, you're starting Anchored Hope. At what point did you decide, okay, a podcast should be part of this ministry?
So I'm on 2 podcasts, and I feel like both of them happened to me. So I was not out to make a podcast, but I do love creating content. I was a writer for a long time. I spent a lot of time writing, and seasons of life look a lot different. Now it's easier to have a conversation than to sit down and write. But as we were having conversations as counselors, we're always having thoughtful backdoor conversations. And the thought was, what if we actually had this conversation in front of everybody? Would it be helpful for people to actually hear how we talk through the nuances of everyday issues that we're all kind of working through? If you notice on this versus that, the comparative nature of the two, whatever those 2 things are, they're different from season to season. But it's really about, here's how we as counselors, or someone who's written a book on the subject, or as someone who's leading in a particular context, here's how we talk about it. Here's what we think about it. And so the idea was just to give people insight into, here's what our conversations sound like when people aren't around.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what was the goal originally? You said it kind of happened to you. So what then, as you took it and formed it, what was the goal?
Yeah, I think obviously to encourage people and to not to make redundant content. There's so much content being made. And so I didn't want to make content that is just one more thing to listen to, but it was different enough and it was nuanced enough that my goal was for people to begin to learn how to think very intuitively, but also with a critique of, I'm living this way because I'm thinking this way. The tagline for this versus that is what we think and why we think it. And what we'll find is how we are thinking about things really determines how we live. And sometimes how we live can be confusing to what we say we believe. And so if we can track back to, here's how I'm thinking, which is why I'm living this way. And that's where the red flag comes from. I need to track back to, actually, here's what I'm thinking on a daily basis. And here's why my thinking's wrong. And so oftentimes there's a nuance in these different conversations of, you brought up Abby's episode, exhaustion versus perseverance. If I'm thinking about being exhausted, how does my life actually change if I think about persevering in the midst of it instead of just, I'm exhausted. So there are tiny little thought changes that we can make that could impact us in a huge way. So that's really where that process came from.
Yeah. So as we're talking about that a little bit, so I'd love to dive into more of the concept. So as you're getting it started, what made you decide that this was the format and you wanted to compare these ideas and the mindset change that happens with that?
I think that's just how my brain works. Honestly, I'm working through the differences and the nuances of ministry and life and conversations all of the time. And so it's just a very natural, for me personally, it was a very natural flow of here's how my brain works. And so here's, if I'm going to do this, if it's going to benefit us as a ministry, if it's going to benefit the body of Christ, then this is how I personally can do this. So I think I tell people all the time, I feel like I have like dwarfs or minions in my brain that are running around all the time. It gives you a little weird metaphor there, but in some ways it's showing here's how we should think biblically about these particular things. But the nuances make such a big difference. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah. No, yeah, that's great. Because I feel like anytime that a format like that is specifically an individualized thing, like this is how I think about things anyway, I feel like that automatically makes that format work really well because you're so bought into it. Like this is not me trying to force something to happen. This is how we just, like you were saying, these are conversations we're already having. And let's capture it because other people can benefit from it.
Yeah.
So that's huge. So you published the trailer for This Versus That back in March of 2023. And so you've now published 54 episodes and you're in season 5 now. So I'd love to know, as you think back on the beginning, back in season 1, what were some of the biggest hurdles that you had to overcome?
Yeah, well, we do seasons instead of weekly because my life very much runs on seasons. I'm a mom of 3 kids and they're growing fast and they keep me very busy. I'm on staff full-time at a church. I run Anchored Hope full-time. So I essentially have 2 full-time jobs and then a third one, if you count my kids and my husband, keeping things afloat. So I don't have enough consistency to be able to say I'm going to do this every week. And I wanted to be very particular about the conversations that we were going to have. There's too much content to just be making content to be making content. That is a pet peeve of mine. So if I'm going to have these conversations, they have to be very particular. There has to be a specific reason behind them. And the only way to do that was to do it in seasons. And also, just very practically, we were moving at the time. So we've now been in New York City for a year and a half. So a lot of those seasons, the beginning of them, I pre-recorded so that when I got here, I had 6 months of content already recorded so we could just play it. Yeah. Now we're past that and now I'm having to record, which is okay. But so I stacked those in a season form to be able to do that. Podcasting is a lot of work. People don't realize how much work. And so for me, if I'm in a season right now where if I don't see a benefit of doing it, if there's not fruit and I can't point to the exact fruit, then it doesn't have space for us in our lives. So I needed to pre-record those in a season format so we could see if there was going to be fruit that came from them.
Yeah. So let's talk more about that. So what was some of the fruit that you have seen that's been fuel to continue going?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that. And I was trying to think of the answer to that. I'm sure there's more fruit even. And I find this with Anchored Hope. Confidentiality is king in counseling. And so there's so many stories I think about all the time. I know stories, incredible stories from people receiving salvation all the way to people being cared for in ways that you cannot imagine because we had this virtual platform. I mean, shocking ways where you're like, Jesus reigns and he's the only one that can make this happen in a virtual setting. Just shocking stories. And obviously those stories are not mine to tell, but I think in a lot of ways, having these conversations, one, gives hope for people who are struggling with whatever the particular issue is that we're talking about. But 2, I think it's normalizing counseling in a sense of if this is how we're talking about it, then I can maybe get comfortable with seeing a counselor at Anchored Hope. Or if they're talking about this issue, it means that other people want to talk about this issue. If they're not scared to talk about pornography, or if they're not scared to talk about fill in the blank, then maybe I don't have to be scared to talk about it. So I think the fruit has really come from people listening to the podcast and learning from it, but then also being free to talk about the hard things in life.
So have you found that a decent number or been able to keep track to some nature of, hey, these people that are deciding to work with us have come through the podcast?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think I'm always shocked so when you come to Anchored Hope and you fill out the intake form, which is a really light form, we ask, how did you hear about Anchored Hope? And we have a ton of church partners. A lot of organizations partner with us. And so sometimes it's the church or the organization or my mom or my friend or whatever. But it never ceases to amaze me when they put Instagram or when they put the podcast. You're like, people are finding out about Anchored Hope because of the podcast. And it's not about the numbers. It's about the souls being cared for in ways that they wouldn't be otherwise. And that is the beauty of the virtual platform, is that people don't have to leave their home. If they're uncomfortable getting help, or they don't have time to leave and go across town, or even they don't even want to wait on a wait list for 6 months to get into a counselor, they can get into a counselor. And they find out about it through This Versus That because of the people on the podcast or maybe sharing about it or talking about it. And so there's a marketing piece to it that is secondary for sure that's helped Anchored Hope. But for the most part, it's just people being encouraged to have conversations.
Nice. Yeah, so probably part of the way in which you're getting those responses on Instagram and more people are seeing it is because you've had some well-known performing artists, authors, podcasters on your podcast. And so you're able to kind of cross-pollinate with the people that they're following, right? So I'd love to know how you've built those relationships over the years to then have people like Shane and Jenny Owens and Jen Wilkin, Jamie Ivey, and Abby Wedgeworth on your podcast.
Yeah, I'm old, Tim. So I've been doing ministry for a long time, so I know these people. Our friends are in school together, and we're on staff together, and we worked on a project together. And, you know, I went to a seminary and worked on staff there for a while, and I've done ministry in a lot of different places. We've moved around quite a bit. And so just by the nature of doing that, building relationships with people, you know, Shane, our kids went to, they all have girls, and we all went to school together, and their wives are the superheroes, just for the record. And then you have Jenny Owens is on staff with me. Yeah. And just mutual friends of friends. So it's just a long-term friendships from doing ministry for a long time.
That's great. Yeah. So what are some other opportunities that have come out of you having a podcast that you probably wouldn't have otherwise had?
Well, I get requests from Tim to be on podcasts like this. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think that it gives some clarity to who Anchored Hope is. And so I do think that it helps us give a voice to who Anchored Hope is so people understand, as Brian, my co-host, he's the director of operations for Anchored Hope. And so when you have the two leaders of the organization speaking together, you really get a sense of who the organization is. We are big on core values and what do we mean by specific things, because the counseling language can get mushy and weird and people think about different things depending on what word you use. And so I do think it has given Anchored Hope an identity in who we are and how do we talk about things. And so in that sense, it's given a voice to Anchored Hope where you wouldn't know as well who we are without it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about podcasting is the medium allows people to spend time with you.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the other platforms, it's like people are spending 60 seconds or less with you, you know? It can be really quick interactions. But podcasting, people are hanging out for 20, 30, 60 minutes.
Yes. I would make a terrible influencer. Like nobody wants me videotaping myself throughout. I'm impressed by the influencers that I follow and I enjoy following them. I don't enjoy following all of them, but some that I do, and I could never do that. But a podcast I can do because I get to explain myself in a lot of ways. And the pressure's off a bit more for me there. And so I do think it's just a space that I can fit in. I feel comfortable enough to fit into.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you look back on the year and a half that you've been a podcast host, how has having a podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry at Anchored Hope?
Well, and what I've already mentioned, I mean, I think giving our ministry a voice was really important, and letting people hear the content of here's what our core values are at Anchored Hope, and here's how we talk about things. And one of our core values is convictional kindness. We want to be kind. We are convictional in what we believe, but we're also going to be kind in how we talk about those things while being professional or while being relational. And so I think it gives us a voice, and in that way gives us a platform to speak. We don't need to speak into everything, but speak into the things that we do feel like we want to speak into.
So I'd love to get into some of the technical production side of things here for a little bit. You're talking about, that podcasting takes a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
And so let's talk about workflow for a minute. What needs to happen on your side that you feel like makes it easy for you to consistently publish a podcast?
Well, the joke is that I run a tech company and I have a master's of divinity. So, and we're way more than a tech company. It's a joke. But I would not say the tech side of this. You were telling me what to do with my microphone before we got on here, but you were talking about my podcast. The irony of that's not lost on me. I would not say that as my strong suit. We contract with a company called Marketeering. And Calvin Payne is who owns Marketeering. He's a good friend of mine. So we record it and he makes us sound better than we actually do.
Nice.
Not by changing the content, but by making the sounds, better, or by cutting out me saying, I shouldn't have said that. And that shouldn't be public. And let's cut that out. And he does, and he edits it out.
Yep.
I'm very laid back. Like if I was super serious about this, they probably would prefer for me to be more serious about it. Oftentimes Brian writes the questions for our guest, and then we get on and I say, I haven't read the questions yet. So just so we're all clear, we're about to roll on this. And part of that's just my season of life. There would probably benefit from me sitting down and doing that. And at the beginning I was able to do that, and now I'm not able to do that. So it just kind of has flowed with the seasons. What was your original question?
Yeah, just workflow. And you kind of explained that it sounds like Brian's writing the questions.
Yes.
You're coming to the table. You have a production company that's helping you do basically just take the raw files and then send you back a final file.
Yes. Yeah.
Any other elements that make up that?
Yeah. I mean, I have a running list all the time of when a topic pops up into my head. I kind of thought, are we going to run out of topics if we do this versus that? And I'm shocked that we have not. And I probably have 100 more topics that I'm going to wait to roll on in the next couple seasons. So I think I'm thinking about the topics and thinking about who I want to speak on those topics. Brian's writing the questions, and then Marketeering does all of the heavy lifting for us.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes I go into a studio to podcast. I have one across a couple blocks down that I can, but sometimes I can't even get there. That's like an extra 30 minutes of my day to get there and get back. And so sometimes I don't even do it. So in terms of workflow, we kind of have a system that could be better, but works.
Yeah. So I'd love to know too. So you've talked about, you sometimes go to studio, sometimes might be in whatever space you're in. What are some of the tools that you use to record the podcast that other people should know about, that are other ministry leaders that would make their process of starting a podcast easier? Yeah,
I would say don't stress out about the tools. So I'm a very low maintenance, like if we were going to try to make this a big deal, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. So we literally just use Zoom. And sometimes if I listen back to it, I'm like, oh, the quality of that could have been better. And I could have made it better if I had actually walked down the street to the studio or whatever it might be. But for us, that's not the point. I do think that we should do all things with excellency. I don't necessarily have the bandwidth to figure that out. And we might change at some point to doing something else. So right now, we just have microphones, we use our computers, and we just record on Zoom.
Gotcha.
And so it is just simple and easy. And if it was not simple and easy, I would not do it. And I will say this. So I do another podcast with Michael Keller at Redeemer, and it's called the Q&R podcast. And it is an entirely different setup. We have a planning meeting, and it's part of my hours at the church being on church staff. Yeah. And they're heavier questions. And he's coming from a really different, he doesn't have a different perspective or worldview than I do, but he just operates differently than I do. And we have a friendship where we can kind of go back and forth in a sense, and we're answering harder questions. It's a bit more for the skeptic, and it's a long form podcast. So we plan for that. We have a studio where people come in to record it. It is on video. It is on YouTube. It is, which this versus that is not. And then we plan that out. And it's such a long form and so much work that we only do one a month. So that is wildly different than this versus that.
Yeah. So I'm guessing there's a whole team from the church that helps coordinate that and make that all happen, as opposed to,
Yeah. And there's a lot of thought process because it's built for the skeptic, and it's built for people asking very particular questions that are not necessarily. I bring a counseling sense to that because I am a counselor, and he brings an apologetics sense to that because apologetics are his thing. And so it's kind of a crashing of how do we take an apologetics question and how do we manifest it in the lives of people who have real suffering. So that is wildly different. And I don't know that the content ends up being a whole lot different, but there's a whole lot more that goes into that one
Yeah.
than this versus that.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. We'll put a link to that show as well in the show notes if you want to go check out that show as well. So let's talk about monetization a little bit. So the whole thought behind monetization for a lot of folks is advertising. And, if people think about starting a podcast and, we're going to make money on podcasting. But it's not as easy as it sounds. I've had some friends of my wife say, you must be, Tim has a podcast. So is that your main source of income? No, it's not. But what monetization strategies have you found to be effective for your podcast?
Well, that's not our goal. Monetization is always nice, but it's not our goal, particularly with either of them. So we have had sponsors to start, a couple of sponsors to start, but I feel like if you're going to have sponsors, it really needs to translate into fruit for them. And we have a lot of listeners. Our numbers are good. There's someone listening to our podcast every single day. So it's getting played every single day. And so I think that's just not my goal. Yeah. And our goal is to help people and to point them towards a resource that can maybe help them even more. And so in that sense, I think we could get to that point, but it's not my goal.
Yeah. But to that point too, like some of the way in which you're monetizing the show is actually by converting listeners to clients that you're connecting them with the hope that they're looking for, right? And so it doesn't have to be a direct monetization, but that's probably worked well for your business as well.
Yes, there is a long-term fruit here, and that will turn into monetization, which actually just makes a sustainable ministry. So I won't see any personal monetary return on it, but the ministry could sustain longer because of it.
Yeah.
In terms of financial aid.
Nice. Yeah. So I saw on your website that you also have your media kit. So for those that are not familiar with a media kit, it basically has all of the details about your show of how many people are listening, what the demographics are, that kind of a thing.
I wonder if it's updated. It's probably not.
But one of the, under there, you have a place for people to contact you to be potential partners. And the phrasing that's right above the pricing, I thought is a great way to put this. Support the well-being of others and get your message out. And I think that's a great way to frame, okay, like you're saying, the sponsors that you have had on, that whole idea that you're helping this ministry happen, one, but we're also going to help you get the word out about your product or whatever that's going on. What have you seen to be the best methods for finding the sponsors that you have had on and closing those deals?
Yeah, the sponsors that we have had have been friends of mine who are looking for a particular return on an event. Maybe we had an auxiliary event at the Gospel Coalition in June, and we ran a commercial for that, basically an ad for that. So I think that helps. The Evangelical Council of Abuse Prevention, ECAP, we often run sponsorships for them if they're doing child protection things. A lot of times it just depends on what the need is, if it's particular for a certain amount of time, or maybe a book launch. I know we did one for Ed Welch on one of his books a couple seasons ago. So it really is just depending on that typically gets a pretty good return if it's an event-focused sponsorship.
Gotcha. Why would you say that is?
Because I think the people who are listening to this versus that are looking for help. They're looking for hope. They're looking for a resource. And so if you have a resource that goes along, particularly with the subject of that episode, I think it's a higher return because it's very particular to the listener.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Nice. So as we come to the close, before we get to the high pass segment, what are you most excited about for the future of Anchored Hope and the This Versus That podcast?
Well, we are about to rebrand Anchored Hope. It's not a rebrand, it's an upbrand. You'll know that it's still Anchored Hope. And part of that is because we needed to be able to trademark the name. And so we will be Anchored Virtual starting October 1st. I'm super excited about this because we are doing a division of the organization. So we'll have Anchored Virtual, we'll have Anchored Partners, and then we'll have Anchored Impact. Anchored Impact will be those who want to financially support the nonprofit. Anchored Partners we have hundreds of churches and organizations that partner with us now. And then Anchored Virtual will just be the overarching, this is what we do. We are virtual counseling. We're not losing hope by taking it out of our name. But we needed to be able to trademark the name. Gotcha. And Anchored Hope's very popular. So I'm excited to be able to roll that out because I think as we grow and as we get listeners and as we get clients, we need to be able to distinguish our organization in a way that is sustaining. And so I'm most looking forward to having a ministry that is sustaining and will be long-term. I think we have a great chance of being around for a really long time. And the content of this versus that, one of the best parts is that when you have 50 episodes to go back and listen to, they don't expire. So, what Ed Welch said or what Melissa Kruger said in season 1 is still really great today. Yeah. So it's not losing its worth, even though those seasons are past. So you create a library of content that is lasting.
Yeah, that's huge. So for the ministry leaders that are listening, that are wondering maybe what this partnership thing is that you do as well, that might not have heard of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we partner with organizations, we partner with churches, we partner with even just secular or outside different companies that want to provide counseling for their employees. Gotcha. There's a number of different ways you can do that. We have churches that buy counseling in bulk. So you can buy counseling in bulk for the year, knowing what your budget is, and everyone in your congregation can get 10 sessions, 90% off, or whatever you want it to look like. Or you could just partner to be a referral. This is who we're going to refer to. We often say we don't want to be a cold referral out. We want you to know us. We want you to ask, here's the case I have. Who would you refer to? And so we deeply believe in the embodied presence of the local church. We're not replacing that at all. But I had a pastor yesterday who said, this is amazing because the heavy lifting is done with the counselor. I'm meeting with that couple outside and I get to be the best cheerleader and it makes my job so much easier. So it's not taking away from the relational aspect of the pastor, but it's actually lifting the burden of care so pastors and ministry staff can function better. And so as you partner with us, you can get a sense of, I know who my people are going to talk to. You should know who you're referring to. And you can get in. So we don't have a wait list. My prayer is to never have a wait list because I'm hiring ahead of our need. And we have an incredibly robust hiring system. So who we're hiring, they're there on purpose.
Nice. Yeah.
And I tell people too all the time, if they're hired, then I would put my kids in front of them. That's the standard. So partnerships look a lot of different ways. We don't say this is particularly what a partnership is going to look like because everybody needs something different. So we kind of tailor make the partnership depending on what the need is of the organization.
Nice. Well, very cool. All right, well, let's jump into the high pass segment where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things.
Great.
So first question, what's your favorite underrated restaurant in New York City?
Oh my goodness. Well, if I tell you, then everybody's going to know. So that makes me a little skeptical of answering. There is a Mediterranean restaurant on the Upper West Side called Bustan, Bustan, and it is excellent. I had a group of women here for a women's weekend and I took them to all the high spots and they ended up having to stay because of flights an extra night. And I took them there and they said, this is the best meal we've had. And I was like, it's on my block. It's on my block. So there you go.
Very cool. All right. We talked about at the beginning of the show that you're purposefully raising your family in New York City. So what's your favorite part about raising a family in New York City?
Oh, I am a big fan of talking to your kids about hard things. I'm so much of a big fan that I'm writing a book on that right now, which will be out in 2 years probably. But
cool. Yeah.
I'm writing that with New Growth Press and with Michael Keller. And raising my kids here on purpose has given us a sense of mission for them. And the things that we talk to our kids about they're not happening in other places. It's just they're not as in front of you.
Sure.
They're not glaring all of the time. And so being able to have hard conversations and very particular conversations and conversations that make me uncomfortable, but being able to show them this is who God is and this is how he's working and this is why we're here. And you were created for a purpose that is bigger than going to third grade and, getting your ice cream at the end of the day. And those things are beautiful and wonderful and we're going to do them. and they are gifts from the Lord, but we're here for a very particular reason. And so I love raising my kids here. It is hard. It is hard. It is hard. It is hard for so many reasons. But the truth is that raising your kids anywhere is hard. Like, depending on, the hardness might change and shift and look different, but being a mom's hard and it's going to be hard anywhere. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. We have 3 girls as well. We're years behind you. We have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 6-month-old. Right there with you. So about to have some difficult conversations of some nature before too long, I'm sure, at this age.
They'll be asking questions. Yes.
Yep. So that's what we have to look forward to. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how this versus that has impacted their life?
I don't know that I have one big giant story. I think that there are probably a whole lot of stories. Just the nature of it is that I'm not going to hear a lot of them. But I constantly get feedback of, I listened to this episode and here's how it was so helpful, or it was profound. I was in a woman's home yesterday holding her newborn baby, and she said, I listened to this podcast with you interviewing Alicia Britt Cholet. And I was like, yeah, isn't that good? She goes, she blew my mind. I've never even thought about those things before. And I was like, yeah, me too. Isn't she amazing? And so I think one of my favorite things is that it sparks conversation with people of, I never thought about it like that. I never even thought about those two things being completely different from each other, or I never thought about it in that kind of context. And I think it's encouraging to people. And so I get, it's like a drip, like a faucet. It's not gushing out, but it's a constant drip of feedback of, hey, that's so encouraging. I sent this to my friend who was struggling with this, or I sent that one to my friend who's struggling with this. So it's a slow drip of feedback more than anything. Nice.
Cool.
I will say, so with the Q&R podcast, I get a different kind of feedback from that one.
Okay.
I had a friend who she plays a lot of tennis, and she was talking to her tennis coach, and she's been talking about the gospel to her tennis coach. And he was asking questions that she did not know the answer to. And she said, but I know someone who does. And so she sent him, they've been listening to the Q&R podcast together because it's an apologetics podcast. Yeah. And she said, I don't know the answers to these, but you answered them and we're talking about them together. So I think that's an amazing example of content where a mom across the country who doesn't know how to theologically answer a question, but wants to share the gospel with her tennis instructor. And we've given her a tool to be able to do that. And that's really what content making should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. All right. Well, as we close, who else do you know that you think would be a great guest on this podcast?
Well, I was thinking about this. So Sharon Betters has a podcast that she has done for years and years and years. And I would say it's a sleeper because she has a lot of people on it. It's called Hope and Help. She is the co-founder of Mark Inc. with Chuck Betters. Okay. And their son died in a car accident when he was 16. And Chuck is a pastor. And so out of their grief, they just began teaching people. That's a good one. The other one would be Matthew Thompson's Mighty Pursuit. So they're actually the company that helps with a Q&R podcast, but he has his own podcast that he interviews a ton of people on. It's fascinating.
Nice.
Those would be the two that I'd send you to.
Nice. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Bekah, thank you so much for taking the time today to share about your podcasting journey and how it's impacted the work that you get to do at Anchored Hope.
Happy to be here.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Bekah and getting to hear her mindset around podcasting, along with how it's been effective for adding more clients for Anchored Virtual. You can listen to this versus that with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out, so together we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Paul Colligan. He's the founder of the Podcast Partnership, where he helps people leverage technology to expand their reach and revenue with reduced stress and no drama. Now, this is a different type of podcast episode because we're going to do a deep dive on the podcast charts, why they matter, and how to rank on Apple Podcasts. So Paul and I are going to talk about the elements that go into ranking on the Apple Podcast charts, his effective strategy for reaching the top of the charts, and we'll end with a case study to walk through how to tactically do the same with your podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.